I'm just calling it out. Like, this is the problem. This is the soft underbelly. This is a huge issue, and it's not getting resolved. Would you guys like to see this video that has gone viral of a woman who explains why she almost divorced her husband? I thought we could start there.
Yeah.
Because there's something unique about the way she talks about this that I think y'all might have some thoughts about. I'm here for that. So I'll share this.
I've been with my husband for almost 20 years, but about 3 years ago, I was strongly considering divorce, and I want to talk to you about why. So I'm going to tell you the story of the day where I thought to myself, maybe I don't want to do this anymore. My husband and I had 4 kids. We both worked full time. We had been together for 16 years at this point. We've been together since high school. And on paper, I have an amazing husband. He is incredibly supportive. He's kind. He's loyal. He's a great dad. He's very hands on. He's an active participant. He's always present. Like on paper, what else could I ask for? But in reality, my experience is very similar to the experience of other women. I had this amazing husband who on paper was great, but I was incredibly frustrated and burnt out from our marriage and from motherhood. Because what happens to so many of us is that we marry these amazing men and we have amazing relationships and then we have kids. And when we have kids, women tend to carry a disproportionate amount of the work in the home, the work of raising kids, and the mental load. And that is exactly what happened to us. About 3 months after my 4th baby was born, I remember looking at my husband and saying, I need more. I need you to do more. I am exhausted. I am in charge of everyone and everything in this house. Every night when we cook dinner, you ask me what to make. Every day when you drop off the kids at daycare, you ask me what they need in their backpacks. I am the project manager of this home and I need you to do more. And he looked at me and he said, okay, just tell me what to do. Right? Every woman has heard this. Just tell me what to do and I'll do it. And I said, okay, something that would make my life easier is if in the mornings when I came downstairs with the 4 kids, because I do mornings by myself, the dishwasher was emptied, the dishes were put away, and the trash was taken out. That would make my life so much easier because when I've got the 4 kids running around and the baby crying, I can't be looking for their favorite water bottle in the dishwasher. I just need to know it's clean. And he said, yeah, of course. What? Yeah, I'll do that. That's no problem. And so, of course, he does it. But then I have to remind him, and then he forgets, and then I have to remind him again. And there was this one morning where I woke up and I went to put something in the trash and it was overflowing. And I went to get my son's water bottle and it was in the dishwasher with all the other clean dishes. And I felt so disrespected and unseen and unvalued at that point in time. And I remember texting my husband being like, what happened? Like, why didn't you do this? And he said, sorry, I was running late for work. And I remember thinking, oh my God, he doesn't see me because what he's done has now made me late for work. And he doesn't care about that. He doesn't care about the impact on me. And he doesn't see how every single thing in our home happens because I ask him to do it, or because I do it myself, or because I planned and organized it. The diaper bag is full because I filled it, right? I put the wipes in there. And I felt so frustrated. And I remember thinking, what's the point? What's the point of doing this with someone else? I might as well just do it alone. And it's not because my husband didn't love me or he did anything to me. And it's not because I didn't love him, but because I felt so taken advantage of in our relationship. And this dynamic, it doesn't happen by accident, right? It's not like my husband did it to me, but we've been raised in this society that tells men and women who they should be in marriages and what it looks like to be a good mom versus a good dad. We know the bar for moms is way up here and the bar for dads is way down here. And we fell into these norms. We fell into these roles in our family, despite the fact that we never wanted to. And I'm lucky, and I say lucky because I have a partner who I know loves me and wants me to be happy and was willing and able to change. And so we did the work to figure out what equity looked like in our relationship. And I can tell you now, 3 years later, that we are happier than ever. Our kids are thriving. Our home runs like a well-oiled machine. And that took a lot of work. I want to say it took like 18 months to get there, and it was well worth it. But it is not uncommon. And so if your wife is coming to you and she's saying, I'm burnt out by the mental load and I need you to do more, she's not just saying that because she wants you to do more chores. She's saying that because truly it can hurt your relationship. It can ruin your marriage if you do not participate in an equitable way in your home. And so what does that look like? What does it look like to change these dynamics? Well, we need to really assess in our homes what the work looks like. Because in most homes, the data supports this, women do a disproportionate amount of the work. They just do. They do more of the cooking and the cleaning and the laundry and the childcare while also working full time. And men have more time for things like their hobbies, like golf, for example, or just working out, running a marathon, right? And so we need to have hard conversations about what our time looks like, what our labor in the home looks like, what is invisible labor. We have to talk about these things. And when we don't, the alternative is that you no longer have a marriage or you don't have a happy one at least. And so I share this story because I don't think I'm alone in this experience. And I want people to know that there's hope and that if you have a willing and able partner, you can change this. You can absolutely change this dynamic.
There you go, guys. You could change this dynamic. All right. What do you guys think of that one?
Well, I think it's funny because there are small parts of what she said that I do really relate to. So I think that what she's saying, well, actually does resonate with a lot of women. And I think that's what makes it so tricky, because it's like, "Oh, yeah, I do carry more invisible labor, and if I ask for your help, you do need a list. You can't just help without having it exactly laid out." Like, things like that, that I think is probably the majority of people's experiences in their marriage. But obviously the 2 things that I would disagree with, or, like, just say are part of the equation, is that I think she was actually right if they're both working for her husband to have to share more of that load, but it wasn't like, I don't know if that was actually the right conversation needing to be had. Like, maybe you shouldn't both be working outside the home as much. I don't know. That's the conclusion I would jump to, because whether women have a workplace job or not, they do inevitably carry more of that responsibility at home,
Yeah.
like you said.
Yeah, totally. It's difficult. Yes. Trying to figure out if it's possible as a husband and wife to both work full time, have 4 kids, do everything that the house needs to do to run, and not have some inevitable gap that somebody's going to have to fill,
Yeah.
that isn't possible to be easily filled. Um,
And she's probably right that most people, if they get to the point that she did, like, don't either they aren't willing to put in the work to figure it out, or their husband is not. And so, like, I'm happy for them. It seems like they were able to come to a place where they could figure that out and not get divorced. But it seems like the conclusion they came to was him being more involved in the home.
right. Yeah, I think what strikes me about this is kind of going all the way back to the beginning of her description. It was like this whole thing hit her by surprise. Like, I can't believe this is happening. Like, there is more work to be done than I can possibly get done. My husband doesn't seem equipped to actually help. He's doing probably all the things that he can, but it's just not enough. And so now we're stuck. Now I'm stuck doing even more work. And I think that what's really tricky is that expectation that you're not going to like that this is not obviously coming for you, and that you need like somehow you need to have a culture that has the wisdom to help you figure out how to deal with this. And it's interesting that she talked about. She said we did the work for 18 months and we solved this, but it was a lot of hard work. And I'm like, man, what was that? Like, and
Yeah.
why wasn't that done before? And how can we give this to people? Like, sort of like what she seems to be expecting is, okay, this was going to happen in your marriage. You're going to like both be doing your own thing. You're going to be out there working separate lives. And then you're going to start having kids. And then these kids are going to create this giant workload. And this giant workload is going to wreak havoc on your marriage because the woman is likely to do more work. And then you're going to have, it's just like she's walking you down a path that I think is extremely common. But the problem, of course, is how is this happening to everyone at the same time without us noticing that there's some kind of enormous design problem with the entire thing. That's where, yeah, I'm like wrestling with this.
It seems like it's the classic problem of, like, wanting to keep your life normal, like, what is normal to you, what you're used to, and then sprinkle kids on top of that. And then when that gets hard, then what gets sacrificed, or
Right.
Yeah, I thought it was so funny when she was like, "Our marriage is going great," and then we had kids.
yeah.
Like, you weren't expecting it to get harder or, like, your solution wasn't to, like, I don't know, focus on the home more. It's like the home is the problem and the work at home is the problem, and the fact that you're, like, a forgetful man is a problem rather than, like, figuring out why that is so hard. And it's like, well, it's probably because you both are full-time workers rather than, like, having some kind of handle on the workload of the home, because when you do have, what she said, like, 3 or 4 kids, like, that is a lot of work.
Yeah.
Also, it sounded like they had 4 kids, and it looks like one of them was a baby after
Right.
16 years of marriage, which means they probably waited a while, which isn't in and of itself bad, but you can see how, like, you settle into and get used to a certain lifestyle,
Mhm.
and how you 2 just work so well together and have such a great marriage, and then you have kids, and it's like, "What happened to my marriage?"
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, it's the whole thing suggests the family is sort of the afterthought. So I wrote this. There's an easy solution to this problem. You need to have a weekly meeting. The same kind of problem solving meeting every work team holds to deal with these kinds of problems. We don't understand that families are teams and teams have meetings and teams exist not just to solve problems, but to also achieve a mission. These two are acting like individuals on their own self centered missions, negotiating who will get stuck serving the common team. That's the wrong frame. So
Mhm.
the whole thing is what are we building? And so she's building her life, he's building, his life, and it's like they're sort of stuck, like hot potato. Who's going to have to? And we have to negotiate. And if we love each other enough, then possibly we can come up with some magical solution where neither of us, we both kind of resent our lives, but don't hate our lives enough to get divorced. Like that's sort of like almost best case scenario at some level because nobody really is trying to build this team. Nobody is prioritizing this. And I think that the options are that a nobody prioritizes the team, and we have to do this negotiation that maybe at the best 50% of the people will get through without some kind of serious damage or breakup, or two, one person takes on all of the team by him or herself, or three, both the husband and the wife see this as their primary team, and what they're building together is this family, and whatever they're doing outside the family is there to support this. And so that's the different frame that I wrestle with. It's like
Yeah.
nobody is really considering that third option and saying, like, what's really important is we're building this family, and so anyone who can spend a disproportionate amount of time serving the family, that's an incredible privilege, and it's what we both really want to be doing, although we might be wired differently in trying to figure out how to do that. And that's what requires the meetings themselves shouldn't be this sort of self-centered negotiation where we're both trying to figure out how do we avoid doing more work. It's like it's how do we serve this team? How do we pursue this mission? Right. So I think that the framing is always so negative towards the family. What were you gonna say, April?
Well, I feel like just that she used the word, was it equitable or equity?
Yeah, partner, equity.
Yeah, I mean, so what she's saying makes total sense if that's your jumping off point. I feel like she's just coming from a very different place than we are. She's not asking the same questions. And so their whole, even their crisis makes a lot of sense for the frame of mind that they have. But I feel like for a a difference, I would say that even in that context, having a family meeting, I still feel like that could um not necessarily get to the root of the issue. And I don't know. So I feel like for our mindset is very much like being a family team. If you're asking what's best for the family instead of what's best for my career or what's best for your career or what's best for Johnny's soccer career, we're saying what's best for the family. You just end up asking different questions and making your decisions differently. I think a lot of times these situations like this, they probably haven't faced like a massive crisis, maybe, because I think, when you face a massive crisis, it kind of forces you to stop and reevaluate, like a child illness, like a really serious illness for a child, or like a lot of times like a health concern of some kind. And
being able to like reevaluate and just kind of start fresh. I think people almost need permission to say that like, hey, it doesn't have to be this way. Like there are gonna be different priorities in your life. You don't have to be having other people raise your kids. Like you could get to do that. So yeah, I know it raises up a lot of questions of like how, but
Right.
I think that that's what just wanting to sprinkle kids and family on top of your individual lives is kind of a recipe for disaster.
Speaking of recipe for disaster, okay, we got to talk about Israel and what we do with one of the most confusing verses in the entire New Testament around Israel. This is something that Kelsey and I have talked about a lot, and I have a a kind of a new thought about this that kind of came out of a teaching. I don't know, Kelsey, if you had a chance to listen to that teaching from Michael
And
Heiser.
I listened to the whole thing in the car, and afterwards realized I really needed to, like, sit and listen and take notes because I had lots of thoughts and questions and comments as I was listening to it, and I didn't have a chance to write them down, so, um, yeah, it was really good. I need to listen to it again.
Okay. Yeah, it's fascinating. So I'll just describe a little bit about of what Michael Heiser is saying. He's getting a lot of this from a paper that he references, and it's all in reference to how to think about this extremely important verse, Romans 11:26, where Paul ends his great description of the role of Israel and the Jewish people and their relationship with the Gentiles at the end of chapter 11 of Romans. And he says, "In this way, all Israel will be saved." And this phrase, all Israel will be saved, has done a ton of work in terms of people's different perspectives of the future of Israel. And there tends to be the belief that there is sort of traditional replacement theology that says Israel here is referring to all believers. And this is yet evidence, more evidence that the church replaces the Jewish people, and that if Jews want to be a part of what God's doing now, they become believers in Jesus as their Messiah. And really is no there is no future or continued role, unique role for ethnically Jewish non-believers. That's very confusing if you read the beginning of this whole section in the beginning of Romans 9, where he specifically addresses that, and then he also addresses that a lot in chapter 11. So that's a difficult thing to understand, although you're looking at this with all Israel means. Then others believe that there's going to be some massive end times revival that this is referring to. All Israel will be saved because actually ethnic Israel, meaning the current Jewish people, will come to faith in massive numbers. And so that's a possibility. He then puts forth this possibility I've never heard before, and it really kind of rocked me the more I thought about it, because we've been reading in our Bible reading plan Ezekiel 37. Ezekiel 37 is this prophecy about how Ezekiel has these two sticks, one that says Judah, one that says, Ephraim, or for Joseph. And then they're brought together as one stick again. And this appears to be something that's going to happen in the future. And even in Ezekiel's life, those northern 10 tribes were exiled and completely disappeared. And so one of the things that Heiser is beginning to postulate is maybe the church does replace someone. They don't replace the Jewish people, the Judeans. The church replaces Israel, in other words, the northern 10 tribes. And that's why to this day, we don't see those northern 10 tribes. It's very difficult. Like some people think that there's going to be some sort of genetic miracle where we're going to rediscover where the northern 10 tribes are, or maybe who has that DNA in their blood, or maybe they're, in some kind of hidden dark place on the globe, and we're going to just rediscover these hidden tribes, because it's difficult to make any sense of a lot of the prophetic verses, particularly passages like the end of Ezekiel 37, without making reference to this. And so I found this a really interesting idea, that potentially Gentiles are the new Israel in that sense, and that the ethnic group that continues to persist are the Jews or the Judeans, right? Those who are descended from Judah, or those who belong now to the Judeans, which would include, Levites who were part of Judah, other tribes that might have been kind of intermingled with the Judahites. Now they are the Jews today. And those northern 10 tribes that sort of no longer have any kind of real identity, are they the ones that he's referring to here? Part of where Heiser goes is to Romans 9, where he reads these quotes from Hosea. This is verse 24. Even us whom he has called, not from the Jews only, but also from the Gentiles. Verse 25, as indeed he says in Hosea, those who were not my people, I will call my people, and her who was not beloved, I will call beloved. And in the very place where it was said to them, you are not my people, there they will be called sons of the living God. So at the end of Hosea 1, God basically says, look, he has Hosea marry this prostitute named Gomer. They have these two sons, and the second son is Lo Ami, not my people. And so this very famous decision that God makes to separate himself from the Israelites. And he even says in that passage, I'm not doing this to Judah. I'm doing this to Israel. Now, part of the reason why Heiser is saying this is he's saying that phrase, all Israel, that you see there in Romans 11, it's the only place in the New Testament where that phrase is used. But the phrase all Israel is actually used over 100 times in the Old Testament. And it does seem to, oftentimes refer to this connotation of when Judah and Israel come together, then you have all Israel. And so the question that is Paul answering the question, what about the northern 10 tribes? What about these people Hosea was prophesying about, right? Those who are not my people will suddenly become my people, which does appear to be that there's going to be a people that are going to come and replace those northern 10 tribes and become a part of the people of God. Well, that seems precisely what Paul is describing here um, in this passage in Romans 11, people that are grafted in. And so, yeah, I'm just curious any thoughts you guys have about the possibility that what's happening is the Gentiles are being grafted in as a replacement. And by the way, the last thing I'll say is, God has he talks about this, right? He told um, Moses at one point, hey, I'm so tired of these people. I'm going to destroy them and make a people out of you, right? So this idea that God is going to be faithful to his promises to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob by finding a remnant that he's going to choose to bless. Now, of course, in that case, Moses was pleading on behalf of all of the 12 tribes, and God decided to continue to work with the 12 tribes. Well, basically, what this idea suggests is that God has done this. He's basically chosen a particular tribe, the Judahites or the Jews. He has decided to bless them. He's decided to fulfill the requirements of the promises he's given to Abraham through his relationship with the Jewish people. But in order to fulfill the promises he's given to all of Israel, to save all Israel, he's brought in the Gentiles as a grafted in replacement for the northern 10 tribes of Israel. So, thoughts?
I actually like the way that you just rephrased that because I think that helps me wrap my mind around it a little better than how he said it. Because I don't think he outright said, like, that this is how God is fulfilling his promises to a remnant, like, that the Jews are the remnant, like the tribe of Judah. But I guess the thing that I am wrestling with is, like, how to does that still mean all Jews? Because all the Jews that we know today are from Judah or Levi, like, they're from Judea. So, that still, like, asks the question, is there gonna be some type of big end times revival of those people? Like, if they still have to come to know Jesus, to be part of that, like, the full stick being brought back together, because that hasn't happened yet, like, the spiritual awakening for them. Or is it like the more replacement theology one where it's like, well, it doesn't matter really if you're Jewish or not. If you are, great, but really you just need to be following Jesus
Right.
and become a part of this. So I still feel like I like this idea. Like, it's actually very intriguing to me, but it still feels like I don't know, I still don't know how to reconcile the two
Right.
Like, how do the Jews actually get saved? Just by being Jews or by coming to Jesus or some combination or some revival? Something like
Well, yeah, what's really tricky about this is, of course, in chapter 9, verse 6, where Paul starts this kind of section by saying, "But it is not as though the word of God has failed, for not all who are descended from Israel belong to Israel." That to me, verse 6 of chapter 9 is the interpretive key of the entire 3 chapters. Like, you really have to understand what the heck Paul is saying there, because he's really saying, I'm gonna use Israel. He projects, I'm gonna use Israel in 2 separate, completely separate ways. He says, "For not all who are descended from Israel," 'cause that's ethnic Israelites, talking about the Jews, talking about others who are descended from the 12 tribes. Not all who are descended from Israel belong to Israel. Of course, the second use of the word Israel there must be referring to a theological concept of the people of God. And so it seems like what he's saying there is the rest of these 3 chapters is Paul unpacking what he means by not all those who are descended from Israel are Israel. And so when he gets to the end of that discussion and says, well, now all Israel will be saved, it does seem like he must be talking about the second Israel in that passage, because he seems to be suggesting that that theological Israel, that is all those who are a part of the people of God, now they need to be both Jews who are coming into the kingdom and Gentiles who are now in the place of the northern 10 tribes, become, as in the Ezekiel 37 picture, the one stick in the hand of God, that united one new man that Ephesians talks about.
Hey, it's Jeremy. When April and I started our family, we had love but no framework. Everyone was pulling in different directions. Then we discovered God's design for the household, a multi-generational team on mission. That changed everything: our rhythms, our purpose, even how we worked and rested. That's why we wrote a free course called 5 Days to Transform Your Family into a Team. It's 5 short emails with one simple step each day to help you realign your home to God's blueprint. You can sign up for free at familyteams.com/transform.
But does that still leave something set apart for the Jews? It still seems like that interpretation is saying that God's promises to Abraham are fulfilled through the church, and Jews can be a part of that if they follow Jesus, but there's nothing like set apart for them.
Well, it seems like in order for these two to become one, they have to be distinct in some way, right? You have to have distinct Jews in order for them to become one with the Gentiles, in order for all Israel to be saved. So why say all Israel? Why not just say, and now the Gentiles? No. That's not what he says. All Israel seems to be the coming together of Jews and Gentiles. And what's really interesting to me is the history of the Jews of the last 2,000 years is the real miracle of the Jews is their continued cohesive identity, in spite of the fact that they've been dispersed among the nations. Every time you have a new outbreak of anti-Semitism, you have horrible suffering on one hand, but also the explosion and revival of Jewish identity on the other hand. And this constant restoking of the Jewish identity, to me, feels like he's saying, I need the Jews to still be a distinct people. And in order for this miracle to occur, they need to continue to be a certain separate people group, and they have to be distinct in order, because I do want an ethnic fulfillment for these prophecies, but it's not all Israel that's ethnically fulfilling the prophecies. All of the ethnic fulfillment is now being given to the Jews, and the Gentiles are grafted into that as a replacement for the northern 10 tribes. So yeah, I do think that this does seem to signal a unique identity and a unique role for the Jews, all the way until the end, until all Israel is saved.
So would the remnant be a remnant of the Jews? Like, so if the Jews are just one of the 12 tribes, one or two of the
Right.
12 tribes, you could say that they are the remnant because they're only a 12th of Israel. So that would be every single Jew. Or is the remnant just a remnant of them, like people who happen to start to follow Jesus?
Yeah, it would be, there would be some kind of distinct Jewish remnant that represents the ethnic continuity of God's promises to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. I don't think it. I don't because the thing we have to fully take on board is when Paul says not all those who are descended from Israel are Israel. That is a profound rejection of certain people who are ethnically descended from Israel. For him to say there are people ethnically descended from Israel who are not in Israel, then all Israel can be saved without those people, right?
Wouldn't that rejection be the 10 tribes?
Yes, but it could also include non-believing Jews. I mean, a lot of what. So I think that's a big question. Um, so I think that there's like you can look at this at the individual level or at the like people group level. I think that you might come up with a little bit different like understandings. There needs to be a people group called the Jews, right? Who God is working with throughout history, and they need to have a distinct identity. And that people group is a people group that God is working with as a character in his full arc of salvation history, and that he's going to continue to work with until the end. But when you get down to the individual level, are there individual Jews or individual Israelites who are descended from Israel, who through unbelief are no longer a part of Israel because they lived and then died in a state of unrepentance or in a state of separating themselves from God's people through a lack of faith? That seems to me to be very consistent with what Paul is saying here in Romans 9 through 11. But to me, where it goes way too far is to somehow suggest that the Jews themselves are not a character in salvation history any longer. Like they're a critical character in the story to redound at the glory of God in the end. So God is still working with them as a people. But at the individual level, can they be saved without having any faith in Christ, and Jesus as their Messiah? That's that kind of unbelief. But I do think that as a people group, and this is where I think things get really tricky. What shall we say then? The Gentiles did not pursue righteousness, have attained it. That is righteousness by faith, but that Israel who pursued a law that would lead to righteousness did not succeed in reaching that law. So much of what he's saying here is describing the tension that people have with why was Israel rejected, right? And I think that seems to be more of what Paul's arguing for here. I'm explaining how God could have rejected the northern kingdom, those tribes, because it would still have been a huge question that people would have been asking and wrestling with theologically, right? So we know that the way that this worked was that when the Assyrians invaded the northern tribes, their policy was to completely disperse nations, to completely annihilate their identity. And then they'll bring in people from another place into that location. That's where the Samaritans come in, where they were taken from another place, brought into the Samaria, and they were not originally from Israel. And then the northern 10 tribes were destroyed. And as the Assyrians attempted to do the same thing to the Jews, right? To the Judahites, to the Judeans. And you have that famous collision when Hezekiah in Jerusalem is able to, pray to the Lord, and they were delivered from the Assyrians and then eventually conquered by the Babylonians, who had a completely different policy where they would uproot people groups as a whole, allow their identity to remain, although then they would be relocated to a new place. And that allowed God to preserve the Jews and their identity and their ability to then return to the land. But that didn't happen for the ethnic Israelites, the northern tribes.
Yeah, I did wanna clarify, I don't think that any of the Jews could get saved without faith in Jesus just because they're Jews, but I do tend to lean toward some type of, like, revival of the Jewish people in the end times, um, and I still feel like what you're saying that could happen, like the tribe of Judah
Yeah.
has some type of revival in the end, which would be amazing. If it doesn't happen, like, I was wrong. But
Well, yeah, there seems to need to be some kind of. So let me just read, like in Ezekiel 37, it says, "The word of the Lord came to me, Son of man, take a stick and write on it for Judah and the people of Israel associated with him. Then take another stick and write on it for Joseph, the stick of Ephraim, and all the house of Israel associated with him, and join them one to another into one stick, that they may become one in your hand. And then God goes on to explain, behold, I am about to take the stick of Joseph that is in the hand of Ephraim and the tribes of Israel associated with him, and will join it with the stick of Judah and make them one stick, and they will be one in my hand. When the sticks on which you write are in your hand before their eyes, they say thus say the Lord, behold, I take the people of Israel from the nations among which they have gone, and will gather them all around and bring them to their own land. So what's interesting about this passage to me is there's two things that I've really, one is God seems to be indicating that there is going to someday be two very distinct groups after the exile, and you have the Judahites and the people of Israel associated with him. In other words, anyone, like, Paul was a Benjamite. There were obviously a lot of Levites, but they all today are called Jews, which is really interesting, right? So you meet a Levite and people call them Jews, which obviously comes from the word Judah, even though they're not from Judah. And so Ezekiel's saying, no, there's going to be a people group that are going to be fully associating with Judah, but that's going to include Israelites from other tribes that are now associated with him. But then there's this other stick, and you're going to write on it for Joseph, the stick of Ephraim, and all the house of Israel associated with him. Now, but my question is, does this sort of bring into possibility that the church is Joseph? Like, are we supposed to uniquely identify with Ephraim, right? So in what happened at the end of Genesis was that Joseph was given the double portion inheritance. That's why Jacob adopted Ephraim and Manasseh. They represented a double portion given to Joseph, because Joseph was the faithful son of Israel. And so what you have in that story prophetically is Joseph, completely Egyptian, looking like a Gentile, talking like a Gentile, speaking to his brothers, and eventually reveals himself as a part of the family. And they then are like, wow, what you meant for evil, God meant for good. And I'm trying to understand, like, in that story, there's different ways to interpret that story. But one way, given this theology, is that at the end of Genesis, in the story of Joseph, we're given a ability to relate uniquely to Joseph and to Ephraim in particular, right? Like, are we? And so this part of the reason why this is so important is, I think the reason why people fight over a lot of these elements is they're trying to figure out who to identify with, right? We have this emergence of Christian nationalism, which often comes with a heavy dose of, anti-Semitism in a lot of cases, where I think that there's a desire for a deeper national identity that people want to have in order to root their family's identity. And they oftentimes will resent the Jewish people for having such a strong theological identity that can make them feel lesser than, right? And so this stirs up a lot of contention and a lot of disunity between Jews and any ethnic groups, particularly even Christian ethnic groups that are attempting to develop an identity in opposition to the Jewish people. But are we a part of Joseph? This is my question. That's kind of where I'm sort of at in this conversation. If this is true, how much do we associate with Ephraim or with Joseph in our development of our own identity?
It makes me just wish I knew what was true, or what God's perspective was, because it feels like it could really be a part of your identity that you could press into, like, with your kids and things like that, if we really understood the nature of that.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a really interesting perspective, though, because I never heard of that. I like that perspective.
I've always wondered why God allowed 10 of the tribes to kind of disappear.
Yeah.
And that I thought that the prophecies of, them coming back, there's so many places in scripture where it talks about the Lord bringing his people back from the places to which he scattered them. So I've always thought of it as they'll be coming back.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's one of the things I was gonna say, is I have always interpreted that as the 10 tribes coming, but I'm intrigued by the thought that the church could be in 10 tribes, that Joseph I've always thought of Joseph as, like, more of a Christ archetype, so I don't know, but I've always it's one of those things where, like, you learn so much about Joseph in Sunday school, and then you realize that Jesus came from Judah, and you're like, "Well, why do we care so much about Joseph? Like,
Good point.
what"
Yeah.
like and it is it's always been such a funny thing to me, like, I've never really been able to figure out why Joseph has made such a big deal out of, like, chapters dedicated to him and his story, and then Jacob adopting his sons when Judah is the lineage of Jesus, and his one story is about how he slept with his daughter-in-law. So it's like, well,
Right. And Reuben's the oldest. So, but he gets excluded from his because of his sexual immorality as well. So it is just interesting.
Yeah.
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 So I do think that kinda helps click that into place a little bit of, like, what role Joseph has in all this.
Yeah. Yeah, it is tricky because you do have these two brothers who really take leadership mantles at the end of Genesis, and it's not really resolved, right? You have Judah who's being told he's going to receive the scepter in the blessing in Genesis 49, but in Genesis 48, Jacob gives the double blessing, which is usually the ruling blessing, to Joseph by adopting Ephraim and Manasseh, and then by making Ephraim, the younger, the leader, even over Manasseh, his older brother, which then is really representing the sovereignty of God to ultimately be the one who gets to choose who will be, who will have what identity, right? To stir up the potential for enormous envy um, between the tribes and even within Joseph itself. So yeah, to me, it feels like it's really worth like drilling into this at that identity level because I think there's a lot going on here. And I agree with you. You're saying, Kelsey, is that Genesis is such an incredibly powerful prophetic book. And I have never really heard a strong enough argument for why we spend so much time in Joseph's narratives in the book of Genesis. Like you can really understand the reason why we need Adam and Eve and we need Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. But man, Joseph gets basically as much airtime as Abraham. And why is that? What's going on there? I think there's something incredibly significant about Joseph that is yet to really, have yet to really understand fully. And this is starting to make me wonder, is this it? Is this representing the church in some way? Even the way he interacts with the older brothers, the way he defends Benjamin, yeah, all of the elements, the way that he is in prison, the way that he comes to power in Pharaoh's kingdom. It makes me really want to go in and sort of symbolically unpack a lot of those narratives and try to understand from that perspective what those could represent. So,
The prodigal son story, like, how it's just such a recurring theme of God choosing the younger brother over the older brother, and I feel like the prodigal son story really does show, a version of that is the Jews being the older brother and the Gentiles being the younger brother, which would kind of, like, be part of us relating to Ephraim in the story.
yes. Yep. Yeah, but yeah, exactly. There's a lot of this going on. So more to come. Like we need to drill into this a lot more deeply. But I found this thread fascinating and something that really started to click those puzzle pieces together for me. Okay. Now I was going to say, speaking of deep symbolic themes, we need to talk about the swamp hag, right, Elisa? I want Elisa to come in here and help us understand the symbolism here. So I'll play for you guys a little clip about the swamp hag. Swamp hag seems like a really interesting element in so much folklore. I think my favorite quote about fairy tales is a fairy tale is something that has never happened but is
Always have.
Always happening.
that's right, always happening. So the swamp hag has never happened, but is always happening. That's the whole point of a fairy tale or folklore is to symbolically describe a pattern that repeats in cultures, and particularly in European cultures, you have this interesting character of this woman who's like outside the village, and who is sort of seeking to lure away children And it's a really like creepy image, right? And I know, Elisa, you have done a deep dive on, is it the Baba Yaga?
Yeah, Baba Yaga, she's in Slavic folklore, like Russian folklore.
Okay, yeah, describe a little bit about what does Baba Yaga do, and what was she like?
Okay, so Baba Yaga is basically this old hag, or people call her a witch. A hag and witch are very similar terms. And she has this house in the woods that appears in different places because it's on chicken legs. It can like move. And it shows up often. Yeah, it's very funny. It's a hut on chicken legs. And it shows up often when a character is in peril or running away and they run into the dark forest, which you should never go into the dark forest. That's a motto of my podcasts that I like to listen to, Myths and Legends. Never go into the dark
The
forest.
dark forest is dangerous.
Yes, so basically. So some young princess or some prince on a quest will go to the dark forest. They find this hut, usually unoccupied. It has sometimes a fence around it with like skulls and bones, and it's like putrid and gross and scary. And they decide to climb into the hut and seek refuge. And generally, the witch is out, and for I don't know why, but she rides in this mortar and pestle, like the thing you use to grind up
Hmm.
like herbs or whatever, and she like flies around, she's riding around in it. And there's lots of stories. Ivan is like the John Smith of characters, like it's just every prince is named Ivan. And then Vasilisa is a common name. So there's stories of Ivan and Vasilisa where Vasilisa's running away and she will come to Baba Yaga and Baba Yaga will tell her to do these impossible tasks. And if she doesn't do these tasks, Baba Yaga will eat her. And she has just very weird habits and like she sleeps on the stove for warmth, which could be just like an era thing. Like that's just how she stayed warm. She has iron teeth that she sharpens. She is just a very like creepy person who uses people to do her bidding. And then they're like the prince will usually like come along in some of those stories and have to like fight her. I feel like I've only noticed that the princess is the one that has to like work for her and by some magical means escapes her, and then the prince usually ends up like fighting her, but sometimes they go to her for like help because she has like these magical things that she acquires, and so they need to get it from her or something. So, yeah, that's Baba Yaga.
Baba Yaga.
Hansel and Gretel.
Yes.
Hansel and Gretel is different, but she is also an old hag in the woods that eats children, but she has, like, a very inviting home, like, it's made of candy, like, "Come into my house." So it's a little bit different, I feels like, but yeah, very similar vibes.
Yeah. Well, this is fascinating. So I'm going to play for you guys a little clip. There's a video that just was released last week called "We Stopped Fearing Swamp Hags and Society Collapsed."
Oh, funny.
So the idea is we have collectively as a society, like we have, centuries of folklore saying, be careful. If you're in danger, don't run into the dark woods and think that you can trust the swamp hag. I know you're going to have that feeling, but parents were very diligent for hundreds of years to warn their children to not go and trust the swamp hag. And today, our strategy for educating children is to literally drive them to be educated by the swamp hag. That's kind of the thesis of what they're describing. Here, I'll play a little clip for you guys, and we'll talk about this some more.
When you go to the swamp hag's house, what does it look like? Right? It is a mess. There is stuff everywhere. There's rotting food on a table. You go to one of these modern swamp hag houses. What do you expect it to look like?
Modern swamp hag house. It just sounds great.
You expect it to look the same
Yeah, it's just instead of like rotted flowers, there's empty Glade plugins all over the floor.
but let me can you hold on? I just want to finish what I'm saying here. So
And then you need to give me time to move this forward. So
you
can
as a
get to my
swamp
whole
hag in modern times or the past, because you cannot find status within the existing world's metaphysical framework or within the existing world's things that you could do to like find a husband, have kids, work your farm, etc. You look for alternate sources, and the easiest way to build alternate sources is to build up an alternate and completely internal and subjective metaphysical framework. And that's ultimately what mysticism is. And one of the reasons why we try to preach against it on the podcast, because I think the swamp hag is part and parcel with the mystic outsider, as opposed to trying to build constructively within objectively observable frameworks and frameworks that can easily be debated within a community. But continue, Simone.
So I would point out this is not purely a genetic thing, and the swamp hag is different. Plus the banshee, they're different from spiteful mutants, and that they are sometimes time-based or life period-based things. You could have someone who was a normal member of society for most of their lives, and then, I don't know, they end up divorced or widowed and childless, and suddenly they become a swamp hag. A lot of it has to do with the perfect storm of circumstances that lead them to a certain state. And these types of crazy women, crazy liminal women, specifically that manifest historically as banshees or as swamp hags, they're often age gated. Like banshees are not necessarily old women. Swamp hags typically are, but the banshee is something that as I said at the top, Asmongold has sometimes referred to too, or people in his chat have recognized, like, oh my god, she's a literal banshee, which people now mostly recognize as like, oh, like a screaming woman. But originally, the concept was this Irish and Scottish otherworld woman who keens for the dead of particular families, and then this trope only later became this generalized screaming death ghost or attack monster. But the word banshee comes from this Irish word meaning woman of the mounds or otherworldly woman, and she's part of this wider fairy mythos. And she's traditionally, the banshee is supposed to be actually a family specific spirit. Like there would be the Collins banshee, I think. They were attached to old Gaelic lineages, and then if they wailed or you heard their wailing, it would foretell the death of a member of that family. And
Fascinating.
yeah, so the banshee is not, she's not intended to be malicious. Her keening functions as both a mourning and a warning, making her more of like a messenger or guardian than a killer.
Okay, so what do we do with this? Like, part of what I am trying to understand and just like drilling into the mythology here is it does appear like in most cultures, there's an understanding that a series of really tragic events could occur in a woman's life in which instead of really dealing with the tragedy, she decides to sort of take revenge against God and the community by developing her own ideology that makes sense of her tragedy, so that she can. But then she's often then pushed to the fringes of society, and then everyone is sort of warned about her, like, do not go out there. She's dangerous, and she does desire to eat children, and that eating is sort of like, consume them in some way, and that if they are in danger. And what happens in a society like ours that has become extremely materialistic, in terms of naturalism, we don't really think about symbols anymore. We don't hold on to these ancient stories. We don't take them seriously. We don't see them as warnings. We're taking Snow White and just invert and reverse everything and think that's the same story or even a better story. Think we can improve on ancient stories and their warnings, because we don't even seem to understand the symbology or respect it at all. And somehow in this context, we've lowered our defenses and let the swamp hags into the center of society. And that is what they're saying we've done. And there's an inevitable collapse that's going to happen from within if you allow this to occur. Any thoughts about that? So
Yeah, I think a big modern day banshee or swamp hag is a Karen. Someone who is constantly just like yelling, angry at everybody, is angry at society, like protest. I think they said in that video, like protesters are a lot like the swamp hags, like people who just can't like I feel like it has a lot to do with someone who like kind of like they alluded to can't fit into roles in society very well.
yeah.
And so they just kind of figure out how to put their female qualities out into the world some way by advocating for crazy things, or I don't like putting their crazy, weird ideology out there as well. Just like a Baba Yaga would try to, bring in somebody, indoctrinate them, eat them, whatever, make them a slave. I think some women just kind of like have crazy eccentric views of the world, and that they are given a platform through social media, protesting, things like that, and they just kind of like screech at everybody their like ideologies, or I don't know. And it's interesting that a lot of weird ideology is like focused on like children, like indoctrinating children.
Right.
Like
That's
they're
the
not
part
gonna
to me worries me the most because it seems like part of what I can get concerned about is in a society that doesn't have these defenses up anymore. If you are a Baba Yaga, it seems to me like you would want to be involved in some kind of child-centric career path, right? Like, why wouldn't you want that? If your goal is to consume children,
Yeah.
then if society doesn't have any natural defense instinct against what you're bringing into the society, you could easily corrupt um, a lot of these areas in which children are unprotected.
Mm.
So where are the parents in this? Because aren't the parents the ones that are supposed to protect
Right.
Yeah.
the
Like
children?
no one's really warning them about this type of person. This person could even be like their desire to indoctrinate the young could lead them into being a teacher role, I feel like. And the parents aren't like, watch out for the crazy lady that, is telling you these things that aren't in line with reality.
Right. Yeah, the idea that the idea that you would have some kind of tragedy or some kind of set of circumstances in your life in which you would cause you to want, instead of repent or come back into the kingdom or accept the tragedy within the Christian framework, you decide to throw off the Christian framework and adopt a totally new framework of reality, and then take that framework into your profession, as a school teacher or whatever. And that there's no, even within the Christian world, there's not a very strong defense against that. And I think that the just enormous eruption in homeschooling, we haven't really, I'm just saying it's a fascinating thought to me to say, so why are so many Christians homeschooling? And just say, well, because society decided to let the swamp hags teach our children. And we don't think that's a necessarily good idea. Have you ever read about Baba Yaga? Would you let your children, like literally when I drop my kid off, at third grade, um, it's like kind of playing Russian roulette as to whether or not Baba Yaga is going to be teaching my child. Like there is no defense against that any longer in our society. There's no like here's our cohesive metaphysical uh, assumptions about reality. If you decide that you don't want to be a part of that, then we're not going to let you educate our children. There is no defense like that. You can believe anything. You could believe incredibly destructive ideologies, and there is no ideology destructive enough to stop us from saying if you are fitting in these criteria and you have these credentials, you can teach. Like
Yeah.
one of those credentials is not whether or not you have the ideology of a swamp hag.
Yeah.
I was also thinking it's probably also a lot of therapists, especially if
Mm.
they have like some type of traumatic reason for being the way that they are, and they are trying to come to terms with or figure out their own issues. Then lots of people like that go into psychology. Yeah.
Yeah.
Like even if you just think about like all of the gender stuff, it's like the therapist there, you're like, why aren't you doing your job?
Yeah.
Yeah. Like, why are you affirming some people's mental illness when your job literally used to be the opposite of that?
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's so important to reiterate, like, that Baba Yaga has a hunger for the young, and that she, like, just in that way of, like, they're going to go after our kids, and in the way of, like you said, like, people and affirming, like, what mental like, something mentally bad like, Baba Yaga isn't there to, like, help. She's she's there to enslave, to entrap, or to eat the person that had fallen into her way. And that person could have been like a perfectly normal individual before she tripped up and fell into Baba Yaga's hut, and now she's like enslaved with on threat of being like devoured.
Yeah, one of the things that's interesting about Baba Yaga's hut is that there the swamp itself is this place where things are decaying.
Yeah.
They're old bones. So all these are just like symbols of they're they're she's like living in the refuse of society. Nothing can really grow or nothing is going to flourish where she's at. She's at the kind of the edge or the end or the where things are decaying and being kind of dissolved and destroyed so that new things can be birthed. But before that, you're in this sort of decay state. And so she's living, and I really feel like a lot of these women that are suffering from a lot of the gender ideology, they're living in the decayed remains of a Christian ethic. Like
Mhm.
like be empathetic, love your neighbor. They have these elements, but they're decaying. They're not connected to the gospel. They're not connected to truth. They're not connected to the overarching story. They're dissolving and elements of the Christian ethic or the Christian framework, and they're like sort of living amongst the putrid, decayed, dissolving, disintegrated elements of the Christian story, without its sort of cohesion that gives it its life, its vibrancy, its truth, its consistency. But it allows them to live kind of in this sort of dream world of their own making, in which they can be a hero. They can make sense of the tragedy of their life without really wrestling with the truth. And in order to reinforce these feelings and beliefs, and to think of themselves as not sort of a negative character, I think one of the ways in which they can feel good about that is they have to serve and indoctrinate children. Like I think that somehow like serves it's a nutrient to allow them to continue to exist in this space, without really dealing with the actual putrid nature of their dissolving beliefs. All right. You guys exhausted? You have one more in you?
We can do one more.
Yeah, one more. Okay. I am trying to understand something. Do you guys understand when I say evangelicalism, what that is? Or how would you describe what that refers to?
Christians who are not, um I know it's Christians who are not Catholic, like Protestants, but I know that there are some denominations that don't fall under evangelicalism, but honestly, I don't really know exactly what that is, but I typically just think like, um, Baptist, Methodist, Presbyterian kind of denomination.
It's kind of tricky. These words are all somewhat overlapping and slippery, but evangelicalism came as a midway between fundamentalism and liberalism. So what happened in in the most I think in the 1950s, somewhat in the 1960s, you had fundamentalists who were people who were extremely rigid in the way that they perceived their interpretation. A lot of them are King James only. Like, we are trying really, really hard to hold on to the truth. And then you have liberalism, which are these denominations who are basically maybe the Bible isn't the word of God and maybe the resurrection never happened and maybe these are just old folk tales, but let's hold on to our Christian faith as sort of a vestige of our cultural traditions and things like that. So liberalism was really giving way to these kinds of very loose interpretations. The problem, though, was there are people that didn't feel like they fit either very well. They're like, I'm not really a fundamentalist in the fact that I really want to like engage the culture. Like, I really want to see people come to faith. I don't want to just circle the wagons and believe the most strict, maybe legalistic interpretation of the Bible. But at the same time, I do believe the Bible is the word of God. And I do believe the resurrection happened. And so, in the midst of these two elements, fundamentalism and liberalism, arose. They looked for a third word to describe somebody who was kind of between these two worlds. They cared about the world the way liberals did, but they cared about the Bible the way the fundamentalists did. And they invented this world called evangelicalism, which sort of like, it was a kind of a nod to we are trying to be evangelistic. I think that was part of the idea there. So that's kind of what evangelicalism is, and it's kind of gone on for the last 70 years as a rough movement that's kind of morphed and shaped, and obviously, because it's this amorphous, non-biblical like category, it's a little bit up for grabs as to how it'll morph and change. So I'm going to play for you guys something that Tim Keller said just before he died about evangelicalism that I've kind of found kind of surprising and interesting, and get your guys' take on this one.
A one pager would help me.
Okay. Do you think though that maybe in some sense it's actually a blessing in disguise that it's that sort of the parachurch movement we were all relying on for identity has collapsed, and now you have a younger generation of pastors who aren't celebrities, who aren't well known.
So one of the things that they pointed out was that within evangelicalism, one of the confusing elements is that a lot of the life of evangelicalism came from parachurch ministries. These were non-church ministries like the Billy Graham Association, like the Navigators, like Young Life. So much of, like YWAM, so much of what really animated and kept evangelicalism strong was parachurch ministries. And they're going to talk about the impact of that.
Who are just faithful at their tasks. And
I see what you're saying there. It's true that the problem with the parachurch, and that is really, I do think maybe, yeah. I mean, folks like Daryl Hart are who we both know well. I'm not sure I agree with the level to which he would go, but he certainly was right about the weak underbelly of evangelicalism. It was its ecclesiology. That was the weak underbelly.
The weak underbelly of evangelicalism was its ecclesiology.
Is that the study of the church?
Yeah. So ecclesiology is our theology of church. What is the church? And absolutely, so he's saying the reason why the church, evangelicalism was so confusing was evangelicalism never created a strong, cohesive ecclesiology. And so, okay, this is a parachurch ministry. What is this really? Like, Elisa just got back from, Navigators. It's like, where does this whole thing fit together? And what is the church in the midst of the, parachurch, when the parachurch oftentimes is growing faster, is creating more identity, more believers, discipling more people than the church itself.
Mhm.
Very confusing thing that occurred within evangelicalism, and to this day is, I think, animating so much of people's confusion about the church. I'll go ahead and let them finish here.
And you are absolutely right in the fact that the parachurch era in which I became a Christian morphed into the megachurch, non-denominational church era. It morphed. And, I tell this story. I mean, like, I'm in the PCA, and Michael, you probably know this, but maybe what heard about it is in our denomination, we care about what the Bible says about creation and evolution. I've taken the Meredith Kline framework hypothesis.
So one of the things he's going to unpack here is Keller got in trouble for, not necessarily having a strict 24/7 view of Genesis 1. That was very strong within fundamentalism, but evangelicals could decide, there's a little more flexibility there.
Approach to Genesis. And there's other people in my denomination that don't like it. They would much rather do the 24-hour. They believe it's 24 hours a day. But we were able to live. The PCA says you can both be in the PCA. However, there's some people in one presbytery that felt like I'd gone too far, and that maybe I had gone into theistic evolution, didn't believe in an Adam and Eve and all that sort of thing. So they wrote my presbytery, and my presbytery examined me and then wrote back to their presbytery, because there's accountability. Yeah, even in the PCA, there's some accountability. You couldn't do that to Mark Driscoll. In other words, if you felt it was something Mark was doing wrong, there's nobody to write. There's nobody to go to.
Oh.
And the trouble with and I don't know if you know Yuval Levine, who's become a friend.
Yeah.
Well, Yuval's point is that these churches, and even Congress, frankly, that all of our institutions in this country are becoming platforms rather than institutions. They're becoming platforms for celebrities.
Yeah.
And so I do.
Every institution is becoming a platform for celebrities.
I do think what happened was the parachurch, which wasn't so bad, parachurch morphed into these huge non-denominational churches, and not even just huge, just non-denominational churches where there was really no. There are two things. There was no accountability to the past because they weren't confessional, so they were not linked to the past. And then secondly, there wasn't a connection any bigger than the congregation, so that just led to the ability for local pastors to abuse.
Mhm.
And I think you're right. I think that was another part that happened in the, say, 70s, 80s, and 90s.
70s, 80s, and 90s, and we are no more close to fixing this problem at all. I just think, kind of final words before Tim Keller died. This is really, to me, an interesting thing to consider, that the soft underbelly of evangelicalism is a lack of ecclesiology. I just want to say I completely agree with that assessment. I think that the evangelical church has no idea what the church is, and this is why so many people are flocking back to the Catholic Church, flocking to the Eastern Orthodox Church. We're going to see a mass exodus from the evangelical movement because after 60, 70 years of ministry, we are no closer to forming a cohesive ecclesiology. Like we are not answering this question. And so what happened was this sort of like the eruption of these parachurch ministries that were extremely effective in many ways, then morphed into mega churches and non-denominational churches that were completely disconnected from each other, unaccountable to anything else. And then you have, the pastor in skinny jeans who can decide his theology is changing because he read this book, and there's no one who can hold him accountable or impact what he believes. And people are sick of it. And they're like, what are we going to do about this? We lack in ecclesiology, and people have attempted to, insert an ecclesiology like the nine marks of a church and other things. And these things are not really rooted in a biblical ecclesiology. They're just sort of at a post hoc. This is what's happening in our church, and let's sort of baptize it. We're not actually going from first principles and developing from the Bible a cohesive biblical ecclesiology of what is the church. And this is a terrible dilemma for the church today, because after 70 or 80 years of theologizing and growing, and we're all children of this movement. And I'm just saying, I'm just calling it out. Like this is the problem. This is the soft underbelly. This is a huge issue, and it's not getting resolved.
Yeah, that's
I
very interesting.
agree.
More people leaving the the church, the evangelical movement for Catholicism has confused me. So that would be an interesting reason. I feel like the stability of the history and the unity across Catholicism across the whole world is probably very attractive to people who are exhausted by this type of church.
Yeah. And I just want you guys to know, in my like this was something that deeply confused me in my early 20s. I was really disturbed by this. I asked very detailed questions about what made a parachurch ministry and what made a local church, and I could tell nobody could answer that question properly. Like there was no good answer, and I couldn't. It was incredibly frustrating to me because I knew on one hand I can go and serve the parachurch ministry for the rest of my life and be extremely effective in ministry, or I can be hampered with, all of the elements that are required for putting together what you're calling a local church. But I cannot tell from your theology if there's really a difference. I can see the difference in fruit in many cases. And people were trying to make the case that, you should not start young life groups. You should start youth groups within churches, for example, because they're a part of the church. I'm like, okay, exactly how does that work? Like, the parachurch, they're discipling people, they're offering communion to people, they're baptizing people, they're witnessing to people, they have worship services, they preach sermons, they have leadership structure. What exactly is it that this church has over here besides this floating label that you've grabbed onto and stuck on, that doesn't have any really theological reason for it? How do I know? And this is what I concluded in my early 20s. I concluded that churches themselves were parachurch ministries. Like that was finally what I concluded. I'm like, you're all parachurch ministries. Like you're all the same. Like you are a worship service ministry. You like this person over here has created a youth ministry. You have created a worship service ministry. Your ministry is to design and create and further worship services. Then I looked at a local megachurch. I'm like, you're not a church. You're an evangelical ministry. Like you're a parachurch ministry. Like you're all the same. And so it just left me like floating and asking even more fervently, like, what is the church? What is the church? And we spent the last 20 or 30 years trying to ground our ecclesiology in the Bible. And, I've come to very, very, very different conclusions about what the nature of the church is in the New Testament. And it really has kind of created this understanding that I think my belief is within evangelicalism, had they actually returned to a biblical ecclesiology, it would have destroyed the platform on which they were building their churches. So they
Yes.
refused to do the theology, the hard theology of actually understanding what the New Testament was saying the church was. They couldn't do it because if they did that, what gave them the most legitimacy, which was the using the word church, they would lose exclusive access to that word, to that theological concept. And so, in order to resist losing that, they refuse to do this kind of theologizing. And we are paying the price because this weak underbelly is not getting solved.
Yes. Well, having walked alongside you most of those years that you've been asking this question, what is the church? What is the church? I can, I've been on this journey with you. And so I can I know that it's just been very interesting to kind of try things, experiment, do this, do that, and see what the results are, and kind of get to the place where um to hear Tim Keller kind of be able to, sometimes you just have to live enough years to be able to reflect and look back and get perspective on things. And to get his perspective is really valuable on, the 70s, what he's saying about the 70s and the 80s and 90s, what we've been trying. And then here we are 25 years into the new millennia, and it's still, we're not any better off than we were. And it is really, I agree. I've been thinking a lot about like consumerism in the church, and just the whole idea of coming in and sitting down and consuming, and switching churches based on whether like the worship style that you like, or whether or not you like the pastor and the way he talks, or his if he's a speaker that keeps you awake or not, that kind of thing. And it's just, that's what that leads to. That ecclesiology leads to consumerism. Why wouldn't it?
Right.
You just decide which one you prefer based on your own preferences, and that's where you go, and it's checking some box that is extra biblical, and just leaves a lot of room for movement, wiggling around.
Yeah. Yeah. Such deep confusion. Yeah. Very frustrating. So I'll throw out just really briefly. We have a whole class at 1,000 Houses called House for Community, where I do a 6 month deep dive into my ecclesiology. And Story Form Life, we also have a whole session on ecclesiology. I think it's extremely important to solve this. It's very difficult though, because as soon as you get near this, you create the reaction of people who have a vested interest in the
Yeah.
current confusion around church to make sure that they retain exclusive access to that word. They are allergic to having these conversations. I'm personally just tired of it. We're paying too high a price, I think, at this point to continue to intentionally be um, be sending up just confusion about ecclesiology. The Bible is not that confusing on this topic. What's confusing is all of the practices that we've layered on top of the Bible and then trying to read those back into the Bible. If you just start with the Bible and just started to like ask this question, it isn't that confusing, right? The word ecclesia was a very common word in the first century. It didn't mean church. The word church comes from a German word that does mean a building. But that's the word, unfortunately, that we decided to use to translate the word ecclesia. Ecclesia was a governmental gathering when people would assemble in some kind of form in order to make decisions. And you see this even used as the word ecclesia is used in Acts 19, right? When there's a riot and they're trying to somehow get rid of Paul, it says that they formed an ecclesia. Now it's never translated church there; it's translated assembly in most translations. But this is part of again, there's been a real desire to obfuscate the meaning of the word ecclesia. I was always confused about the nature between why does Jesus talk about a kingdom, during the Gospels over and over again, the kingdom of God is everywhere. And then all of a sudden, Paul starts talking about the church. I was just like, this is super confusing. Like, what happened? Where do we go from a kingdom to a church? And of course, it's not confusing at all if you actually translate the word ecclesia as it was a part of it was a governmental word. It was a word for that was a governance word for within a kingdom. And you see these sort of three different layers of ecclesias in the New Testament. You have the church that meets in the house, the church that meets all the believers in the city, and then all the believers everywhere. On this rock I'll build my church, the church in the city of Ephesus, and the church that meets in your house. Those are the three expressions of church in the New Testament. And you can dig into that and try to figure out, okay, well, what do we do with each of those expressions? And how do we think about this from a kingdom lens? Again, none of that work have I seen theologians really approach in any kind of comprehensive way. I've only ever seen this post hoc. We start with what the church looks like today, and then force it back in the New Testament.
Yeah.
You create this underbelly and this complete wash of confusion, which is going to continue to create people who are going I may not agree with the Catholics, but at least they have an ecclesiology that makes sense. I can make sense of it. We have got to stop this. We have to develop a robust evangelical biblical ecclesiology. So I just wanted to throw that out there. There's a lot of work to be done in that, but I think it's really important just to call a spade a spade. At the end of his life, I really appreciate the fact that Tim Keller is able to say this. This is not working. We have this broken element within our theology, and he doesn't really dive into all the reasons why that happens. He thinks having a presbytery, like a confessional official denomination like the PCA, that is one answer to ecclesiology. It's not a biblical answer. It's not like it didn't come from the Bible up. Again, it's to me, it's a top-down ecclesiology. You start with what is, you see what's sort of broken, and then you design a governance structure to do a better job of structuring what is. I'm sick of that kind of movement. I'm like, let's start with what the Bible says and then build something from the Bible up. Let's start with first principles. That's always been my heart. That's been my desire. But I understand. I just want to say, I understand why people are, throwing in the towel at this point and just moving towards something that's at least solid. But we can fix this problem. But I'm just going to throw it out there. Kelsey, Elisa, your generation may be stuck with this one because our generation did not solve this one. We just, I think, added more and more confusion to the question. But I think it's important just to put your finger on the question. We need a biblical ecclesiology if we're going to move forward as a community, as a movement. All right, guys, thanks for hanging out with me tonight. Just a little light conversation to go to bed. Something to think about as you guys slowly drift away.
At least I'll have something other than Dr. Seuss in the back of my head.
That's right. I figured you guys could use some adult conversation at the end of your day. So that's what one of the things that Zoom is good for. Even though we all live on the same street, this is a little bit easier way for us all to get together. So awesome. You guys have a good rest of your night. Thanks for hanging out with me here.
Thanks, Dad. It was awesome.
Thank you for listening to Jeremy Pryor's podcast. Make sure you hit that follow button so you don't miss out on any future content. Follow Jeremy on Twitter and Instagram, as well as his Substack blog, all linked in the description. See you next time.